What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen, and I am back with another true crime video, and this is actually the start of a series. So, for those of you who have been around on my channel for years, first of all, thank you. I love that you're still here. And second of all, a while back, like right when I first created my channel, I did these like mini monthly series where essentially every single month I changed the topic to something involving true crime, like female serial killers or Jane and John Doe solved cases. And most of the videos that month would revolve around that topic. And one thing that I really have been thinking about a lot lately is kind of spreading education on different true crime cases that have inspired a lot of change, whether that's laws that have been put in place after a crime or changes in the victim advocacy world, things along those lines. So that's what I'm going to be doing for the next couple of months. I'm going to be sprinkling in videos. So if you have any suggestions of laws that have changed in your state or a case that has directly impacted the entire true crime community, please leave that down below. Today, we're going to be speaking about the absolutely brutal murders of 31-year-old Renee and her 8-year-old daughter, Shanna Wicklund, as well as their 51-year-old neighbor and Renee's best friend, Barbara Hendrickson. Their deaths prompted a ton of change, specifically in the state of Washington, when it comes to requirements that make it so victims are notified when their attacker is released from prison, because that probably single-handedly could have prevented the deaths of all three of these individuals. I feel like so much of this case was preventable on so many different levels, and it really highlights how important victim advocacy is and support services are for those that are victims of true crime. Now, before I dive into the nitty-gritty details of this case, I first need to thank Audible for partnering with me on today's video. Audible is the leading provider for spoken word entertainment and my personal favorite way to consume content, especially true crime. Audible offers an incredible selection of things like audiobooks, Audible originals, podcasts, there's guided meditation, sleep tracks, and the amount of genres is just absolutely endless. There's true crime, motivation, business, thrillers, kids audiobooks. So there is something for absolutely everyone. As an Audible member, you get a ton of perks, which is one of my all-time favorite things about it. You get to choose one title a month from Audible's entire catalog. I'm talking new releases, bestsellers, and it's yours to keep in your library forever. And you also have access to their Plus catalog. New options are added to the Plus catalog monthly, including podcasts, and all of these are just included in your membership. It's super easy to enjoy Audible anytime, anywhere with their very convenient app. You can listen to audiobooks while cooking, cleaning, working out, doing laundry, you name it. Plus, new members can try Audible for free for 30 days. I just started a new audiobook called The Drop by Michael Connelly. I haven't personally listened to anything by this author before, but it had a ton of great reviews, so I was like, all right, let's go ahead and give it a try. And now I'm absolutely hooked, you guys. So this audiobook is about an LAPD detective that is about to retire. He wants to take on as many possible cases as he can before signing off for good, but honestly, be careful what you wish for, because two absolute messes ended up falling in his lap. He ends up uncovering the possibility along the way, looking into all of this, of a serial killer in the area, and this makes him face the realities of his own police department and the town that he calls home. So if you like this audiobook, there are a ton more where this came from. If you want to check this audiobook out or just see what Audible has to offer that you may be interested in, new members can try Audible for free for 30 days. All you have to do is go to audible.com/Danielle or text Danielle to 500-500. A huge thank you again to Audible for partnering with me on today's video, and for years now, they allow me to do what I do and support these families as much as I possibly can. So Renee Wicklund is really where all of this starts. Renee was born in North Dakota to Alan and Hilda. I think it's Ehlers is how you pronounce their last name. She had a sister, full sister, a half sister, and two half brothers. Growing up, she was described as being incredibly energetic. She was always on the go, always wanted to do something, wanted to participate. She also was a huge lover of animals. She had a pet horse and, interestingly, also a pet raccoon. And she also participated in local 4-H competitions. So she was just a really active child within her family, within her community. And this experience helped her out a ton because her father ended up deciding at a young age to move the family to a more rural town in North Dakota onto a farm. So she was able to take a lot of this knowledge and energy that she had to help out her family. She learned to cook, she learned to sew, she would obviously take care of a lot of the animals, and the farm was something that was always very important to her, something that she cherished and wanted to remember throughout the rest of her life. She was also very musically gifted, which was something she ended up passing down to her daughter. After attending 1 year of college, Renee had her very first experience with the beautiful state of Washington, where she would ultimately end up. And it actually kind of changed her entire path. Renee had basically been put into college after all of her hard work, and because of her skills with music, she absolutely loved school. She always had. She'd always done very well in school. But once she had this taste of Washington State and its beauty, she decided that's her life goal, that she was going to not go back to school. I don't think she even left after she went to visit her sister in Washington that summer. She instead stayed, quit school, and decided to get a job at some local beauty salons. And it wasn't long before a love interest came into the picture. While working at the beauty salons in Washington, she met a man named Jack Wicklund. Now, Jack was about 14 years older than her. I believe that he was divorced and had 2 children of his own, so he kind of already had his life experience, but they fell head over heels for each other, and on February 19th, 1973, Renee and Jack got married just days shy of her 22nd birthday. They settled down in a very quaint, cute town of Clearview, Washington. Clearview is in Snohomish County, and I tried to find the population back in the 70s. I literally could only find the population in 2010, and that's it. And at that time, there were around 3,000 people living in Clearview, so I can only imagine it was decently smaller back then. So it's just this small, everyone knows everyone type of community nestled in the woods in Washington. She was living her absolute dream life. The house that they moved into was on a huge lot. It was like just over an acre. So she was able to still be on a little bit of land after growing up being raised on a farm, which made her incredibly happy. And right away, they started a family. Within 6 months of getting married, their daughter Shanna was born on August 20th, 1973, and she was said to be just this beautiful little replica of her mother. After moving into the community, the Wicklunds became incredibly close to the Hendricksons, Don, and his wife Barbara. They had lived in this community for 10 years with their children, and they absolutely loved it there. Barbara was much older than Renee, so it was a situation where she was a lot more wise. She had a lot more life experience, so Renee could really rely on her when she needed some advice or, someone to lean on. She was able to help when Renee became a mother for the first time, so they had a really close relationship. But by the time Shanna was 1, their lives would be changed forever and eventually taken from them. It was December 11th of 1974. Shanna was just over 1 year old, and typically at this point in the year, Washington State was unbearably cold. Families were bundled up by the fire, but on this particular day, it was said to be unseasonably warm outside, and there was sun. So obviously, Renee wanted to take advantage of this weather. She decided to sit Shanna out on a blanket in the grass to soak up some sun, some vitamin D, and some warmth, and she was going to take this opportunity to clean the windows. After sitting Shanna outside, she was going to run inside really quickly to grab some rags to get the cleaning started, and when she looked up, she noticed that there was a strange man walking up her driveway. As I said, the lots were very large in this neighborhood, and from the way I've seen it described, I don't know the exact address, so I can't look it up, but it's been said that the Wicklund home sat far back on the lot, so the driveway was very, very long and wooded, so it was a little bit strange to see someone walking up the driveway. Now, when she stopped to really look at this man, all of a sudden, he started making an absolute dead sprint directly at Renee, as fast as he possibly could. She immediately ran and grabbed Shanna and tried to make it inside to lock the door to protect both of them before he could reach them. But unfortunately, this man was incredibly tall, had a very long stride, and was able to run way faster than she had thought, and he ended up slamming his body weight into the door, forcing it back open, and he gained access into the home. Right away, this man grabbed Shanna and put a knife to her neck and looked at Renee and said, if you don't take all of your clothes off right now, I'm going to kill this baby. He proceeded to force Renee to perform sexual acts on him while Shanna just screamed helplessly with a knife to her throat the entire time. And once he was done, he thanked Renee and then simply walked out of the house. Horrified, Renee grabbed Shanna and ran to the Hendrickson home as fast as she possibly could for some help. She explained to Barbara what was going on. You can imagine the chaos that was happening at that time. Shanna was screaming. Renee was absolutely devastated and scared that this man was still around somewhere. So Barbara locked all the doors and called 911 for some help. But when police arrived, shaken but incredibly motivated to find her attacker, Renee told them exactly what had happened and also provided a description of this man. So Renee stated that he was going to be very easy to identify because he had some very unique features. First and foremost, he was tall. He was like possibly 6'5", if not taller, very skinny, long, and lanky. He also had red hair that was very bushy. She said it was like an afro style. So obviously that's not like a combination of things you would see every day. She also was fairly certain that this man was drunk at the time of the attack because during the entire attack, all she could smell was alcohol coming off of him. Snohomish Sheriff's Department assured Renee that they were going to find this man, but unfortunately 2 whole years passed before they were able to, and Renee's life just continued to suffer because of what she had gone through. The trauma from her attack affected her in all aspects of life, as I'm sure you can imagine. First of all, it was said that she had all lights on at all times while in her home. It also ended up causing a lot of tension between her and her husband. And by the time Shanna was 3, which was right around the time the attacker ended up being caught, Renee and Jack decided to separate. And he was living away from the home from the way it's described. He spent most of his time traveling for work anyways, so this left Renee and Shanna on their own at this home quite frequently. Thankfully, the Hendricksons welcomed them in whenever they needed a little extra company. Finally, in 1976, he was captured. So Renee was called in to check out a lineup of men to see if she could identify her attacker, and sure enough, she picked out a man named Charles Campbell. So after identifying him in this lineup, which I will get kind of deeper into in a little bit, he ended up being charged with sodomy and first-degree assault. And the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department was actually not at all surprised because he had a very lengthy criminal record. They were well aware of who this man was. Both Barbara and Renee ended up testifying against him, and he ended up being convicted. Charles was sentenced to a total of 45 years in prison. But it was not just for this particular attack. There was more that was going on here. As a background on Charles, his life was a hot mess. That's the best way I can describe it, if I'm being quite frank. His father, Oliver, and his mother, Betty Lou, had moved to Hawaii after having their first daughter. I think they moved while they were pregnant with Charles, and shortly after arriving, they gave birth to him on October 21st, 1954. His father was a Marine, so that's kind of why they traveled a lot and why they ended up in Hawaii, and his mother took odd jobs, usually working at department stores. I think the last place she worked was like Sears. And a few years after his birth, Oliver decided to leave the Marines, and he decided to move the family to Edmonds, Washington, which is where they would remain. They arrived in Washington, and shortly afterwards, they ended up giving birth to 2 more children, 2 daughters, and their youngest was born with a pretty severe disability. There was something wrong with her hip joints, and multiple stressors in life ended up forcing both Oliver and Betty Lou to drinking. They both essentially were severe alcoholics. I think that Oliver was the first to start heavily drinking, and then when Betty Lou was left to deal with him, and all of the children, including a severely disabled child, she eventually fell into it as well. And eventually, according to Charles, this led to severe abuse of him. I don't know if there was abuse allegations in terms of the other children, and more trauma just kind of kept happening within this family. When Charles was 5 years old, there was some sort of event. I'm not exactly sure if it was a medical issue or what, but it forced him to have one of his testicles removed, and psychologists have even come forward and said years later that they believe this may have been a contributing factor to his behavior throughout his childhood and as an adult. Between the drinking and the raging fights at home with his parents, as well as the alleged abuse, Charles began to act out in numerous different ways. He went through multiple elementary schools because he was acting out so violently and aggressively. He was constantly getting into trouble in and out of the home. And eventually, he ended up being labeled as behaviorally disordered. By the age of 10, he also began to drink following suit of his parents. 10 years old, you guys. And that's not even like the most shocking bit of information here. So as he's 10 years old and getting drunk, he starts to vandalize things and escalate his bad behavior to criminal activity. Then by 12, he starts using meth. By 13, he adds in heroin occasionally. And this just keeps escalating until eventually he ends up taking mass amounts of LSD on a regular basis. At this point, he really didn't have a solid place to land because he was bouncing a lot between his parents' home and his grandparents' home. Basically, when he would get in trouble, which was on a regular basis at his parents' house, they would have enough of it, send him off to his grandparents' home, and it was just a whole lot of this back and forth. By the age of 15, he had pretty much all but completely stopped attending school and was getting into even bigger legal trouble at this point. He was stealing cars. He was going on police chases. He had even stolen his own family car in 1971, and his dad ended up turning him in for it. And as he's sitting there with the police, he ends up making his phone call, and he calls a friend and just cool as a cucumber asks this friend to kill his own father. He's like, my father turned me in. I need you to go and kill him for me. The following day, after somehow being released after this, he ends up breaking into his own grandparents' home. He steals several of their guns because he apparently wanted to sell them all so that he could go to California, but he ended up being caught. When he was arrested, police noticed that this 15-year-old kid had obvious tracks on his arms. They asked him what he shot up, and he said, quote, everything except Kool-Aid and peanut butter. At this point, he ended up in a reformatory for boys because no one was quite exactly sure what to do with him. His parents weren't very attentive. They also just could not handle his behavior. His grandparents clearly couldn't handle his behavior. Nothing was stopping this kid from doing whatever he wanted. He had absolutely no boundaries, no limits at all. So that's why he ended up there. And unfortunately, the death threats continued after his short stint in this reformatory. So by the age of 17, when he had been released, he pretty much immediately got into another police chase, and once captured, he threatened to kill the police officer. So as you can see, it's just an absolute disaster. He did not care about anyone but himself, is what it seems like. It didn't matter if your family, his grandparents had offered him a place to stay so many times when he had nowhere else, but he very quickly was able to turn around and break into their home and steal from them. He threatened to kill his own father. It's just a whole lot going on here. And unfortunately, from the way I've seen it described, most of the time, during all this bad behavior, he only got a slap on the wrist. There was never anything huge that happened to him other than when he had to go to the reformatory. But that's literally it. All the other times, he basically was told, stop doing that, and released. So the lack of consequences just helped contribute to this idea that he should be able to do anything that he wants to do. In August of 1973, he managed to charm a woman and get married to her. But just like most things in his life, this too very quickly turned to chaos. They had moved into a trailer outside of his grandparents' home, and police were called there on a regular basis for domestic disputes. Even when his wife was pregnant with their daughter, he would beat her and threaten her. At one point, he threatened to kill their dog, her mother, and her. Out of fear, his wife never ended up reporting this. Then in March of 1974, his wife had their baby girl, and of course, this didn't change anything, but instead just added another victim. According to his wife, Charles would throw knives at their daughter's crib while she was in it because he apparently was angry that she was crying, and that was his way of dealing with it. I've also seen allegations that he dangled his baby over the balcony of a 20-story building. So obviously, this marriage did not last very long, and once his wife was in a position where she could safely get her and her daughter away from him, that's exactly what she did. She filed for divorce in August of 1974, so when their child was just a few months old, and she left him, taking their daughter with her. He did not get any custody of his daughter whatsoever. And it was just 4 months after this divorce that Charles ended up showing up at Renee's home, threatening Shanna, and sexually assaulting Renee. And this was kind of the start to a bit of a crime spree. So just days after attacking Renee, clearly he's on just this high from what he had done. He ended up applying at a place called Pizza Haven under a fake name, got a job there, worked an entire day, and then walked out that night with like almost $2,000 in cash, and then obviously never came back again. Things were quiet for the next couple of years until January of 1976. And I say quiet, we just don't know if he's done anything during that time period. But in January of 1976, he came back full force with a sawed-off shotgun and broke into someone's home. Now, he ended up being found at a nearby bar. Again, drinking seems to be a repetitive theme in this. And he ended up being charged with second-degree burglary. And I honestly believe that this may have been what put him on the radar in Renee's case. I was trying to figure out, how did police all of a sudden find this guy after 2 years? But it was immediately after being arrested for this totally unrelated burglary that she was brought in to identify people in a lineup. So my assumption is that now that he's finally in and being charged with something, they're like, wait a minute, this guy looks awfully similar to the person that attacked someone a couple years back. When Charles went to trial, it wasn't just for Renee's assault either. He actually went for Renee's assault. There were also charges against him for that burglary where he went in with a sawed-off shotgun. And there apparently were other first-degree assault charges that occurred while he was, I believe, in custody awaiting trial. I've not been able to find a lot of details about it. And he ultimately was found guilty in all 3. And so he was supposed to be serving 45 years in Walla Walla State Penitentiary in Washington State. And this was a breath of fresh air for Renee, her daughter, and Barbara. Charles had caused so much pain, so much fear, completely altered their lives forever. And they finally felt at this point that they would be free to start to try to heal and move forward without this looming feeling that there was possibly someone out there ready to attack them again. Until we fast forward 8 years. Wednesday, April 14th, 1982. Renee had spent the last few days very sick. I believe she had the flu. So Barbara, her trusty best friend and neighbor, was coming over on a regular basis, usually in the morning, to make sure that Shanna, who was 8 at this point, was up and ready to go. She also was coming over once Shanna would arrive home from school just to make sure, she got home okay and Renee didn't need anything. She basically just wanted to make sure that everyone was taken care of. And that Wednesday, she decided to head over at about 4:30 p.m. Barbara headed off across the street with a thermometer just to check on Renee's temperature and her husband Don's pocket watch to be able to check Renee's pulse. She told Dawn that she would be back shortly for dinner, so he was expecting her to be back like within an hour, if not earlier. Dawn ended up getting caught up watching TV while waiting for Barbara to get back, and eventually at 6:30 the nightly news came on and it kind of snapped him back to reality. And he's like, wait a minute, if the nightly news is on, that means it's 6:30, which means that Barbara has been gone for 2 hours at this point. And that was not normal. Barbara had told him she would be back within an hour, so if anything had come up, she would have likely used Renee's home phone to call Dawn and let him know what was taking so long. He also didn't think that they would have gone anywhere, first of all, because Renee was so sick, and again, Barbara would have called to let him know. So he decided to head across the street to Renee's home to figure out what was going on and make sure everyone was okay. So when he got there, he noticed that Renee's car was still in the driveway, so they had not gone anywhere, and he was expecting them to be inside the house. Maybe Barbara had stayed to try to cook them dinner, but when he knocked a handful of times, there was no answer at the door. He decided to peek in a nearby window, but every single one of the lights were off in the home, which was unusual for Renee, and he did also immediately see that the back sliding glass door was completely open. He rushed around to the back, saw the door wide open, and started to hear a noise from inside. When he listened closer, it sounded like there was running water coming from somewhere. So he went inside slowly. It's all dark in there. And he realized that it was the kitchen sink. For some reason, it was just on and running, but there was no other movement in the house, no other sounds in the house at all. So he flips on a switch to see what's going on, and he notices that the kitchen is a little bit in a state of disarray. There's a chair knocked over, so worried, he makes his way towards the bedrooms, which is down a hallway across the house, and he's turning lights on along the way. He makes a horrifying discovery. His wife, Barbara, is laying in the middle of this hallway on her back, and she is surrounded in a pool of blood, and it is clear that her throat had been completely slashed. He immediately ran to the living room, called 911, and then ran outside absolutely sick about what he had just seen. Within minutes, right around 7 p.m., the Clearview Fire Department arrived on scene. It was Lieutenant Spaulding and Chief Eastman, and they spoke to Don about what exactly he saw, what was going on. He explained that Renee had been sick, that his wife Barbara had been caring for her and her daughter Shanna, and that she was, away from home and over at the Wicklund home for like over 2 hours. And so he decided to check on everyone, and that's when he noticed the open back door, the running sink, and then saw his dead wife. But he also said, look, Renee's supposed to be in this house somewhere, and her daughter Shanna would have been home from school at this point, so I don't know if they're in there dead too. I don't know if they're in there hiding. I don't know if they're struggling to survive. So both Spaulding and Eastman ran into the home to try to figure out where on earth Shanna and Renee were. After seeing Barbara's body, they continued on down the hallway to one of the bedrooms. I believe it was Renee's room, and right away they found Renee inside of her bedroom, also on her back. Here, she was completely naked, and it almost seemed as if she had been staged. She had her hands placed over her breasts, and her legs were spread open, and she had been savagely beaten. Her face was so badly beaten and mangled that it was near unrecognizable. She also had her throat slit. And just behind her, Shanna was face down, also in a pool of blood. After making these discoveries, Don was devastated. First thing he said was that the only person he could think of that would ever do something like this to Renee and Shanna and his wife Barbara was the man that had attacked Renee 8 years prior. He goes on to explain to these two men from the fire department that he couldn't remember a lot of the details. He didn't remember this attacker's name, nothing like that, but that 8 years prior, someone had shown up to Renee's home, put a knife to Shanna's neck, and sexually assaulted Renee. And he said that this man ended up being found and put on trial, and that both Barbara and Renee testified against him. And that after this happened, he remembered specifically that the man said that he would come back for both Barbara and Renee for putting him in jail, because Charles, in his mind, He did nothing wrong, and his actions didn't put him there, but their actions did. So right away, we already have this person of interest that they're aware of. 7 minutes after Clearview Fire Department arrived, Deputy Pendergrass from Snohomish County Sheriff's Office also arrived, followed by Detective Ward and Detective Bart. And they kind of got a rundown really quickly from the two from the fire department, and they began to very briefly investigate the scene. So first and foremost, they wanted to find where this attacker could have gotten into the home. They knew that the back door was open, and they were able to confirm that that was the likely point of entry because the metal around the screen door had been bent, and the glass sliding door itself was completely off of the track, so someone had basically forced their way in through this back door. When they walked further into the home, the entire house was just in complete disarray. You could tell that there had been a lot of struggling that had gone on within the home. In the kitchen itself, the sink that had been turned on, one of the handles had blood on it, so that made it very likely that whoever did this had washed their hands afterwards. There was also a glass somewhere in the kitchen, like a drinking glass with a bloody palm print on it. Obviously, we know the chair had been knocked over. There were bloody footprints all over the place. There was blood smeared all down the walls of the hallway that Barbara was found in. And right away, it seemed that Barbara had been killed pretty much right after she had made it to the home at 4:30, because she still had her purse hanging over her shoulder. It's very likely that she had walked into the home, very likely through that back door that Dawn had walked in. Maybe she managed to get in through the front door, not sure, but she probably was walking back towards the bedroom wondering where Renee and Shanna were when she ended up being attacked. Again, her throat had been slashed and her left earring had been ripped out of her ear. It was also very obvious that Renee had been sexually assaulted, and it was apparently by an inanimate object. She was severely beaten, as I had stated before. I don't believe the other two were. She had bruises all over her body. Whoever did this, there was a lot of anger and hatred behind it. There was also evidence that she had fought back against her attacker. She had bruises on her knuckles. She was missing a nail, and when they were searching the rest of the home, they actually ended up finding that nail in the dining room. So clearly, this altercation and struggle had been through multiple areas of this home. So all these things knocked over, all of that was likely the struggle between Renee and whoever attacked her. And she also had her left earring missing. It was clear that Shanna had also likely tried to flee the attacker. When they initially found Renee, they noticed very quickly that she had a footprint in blood on her leg. And this footprint, the shoe print, matched the bottom of Shanna's shoes. So clearly, Renee had been killed first. Shanna likely came home next on the school bus, and in order to get away from this attacker, she stepped on her mom after running through all the blood. And then again, Barbara was killed last. And Shanna was the only one face down in the home, and she had her right earring ripped out. So whoever did this was probably a right-handed attacker that had gone around after the fact and taken a memento from each victim. All of Renee's belongings had also just been tossed absolutely everywhere. There was clothes covering the entire home. Her jewelry box had been rummaged through. Half of it was dumped out. A whole bunch of it was missing. When they did searches of the property surrounding the home, towards the back, they did end up finding a couple of pieces of jewelry. So whoever had taken it had likely headed off in that direction afterwards. They also found some of her 4-H trophies down the road, on the side of the road somewhere. So right away, they started to speak to the neighbors to see if anyone had seen anything. And this neighborhood kind of posed a little bit of a challenge again, because their house was tucked back, there were lots of trees, there was a long driveway, and everyone was on a really big lot. So while no one heard anything, thankfully, a lot of people actually saw a ton. So most witnesses all echoed the exact same thing. Multiple witnesses saw a strange man in the neighborhood that day just lingering around, and their 11-year-old neighbor came forward and told authorities that she remembered seeing someone sneaking around the Wicklund home in particular with what appeared to be a knife in his hand. Others said that they saw him walking around with some sort of rolled up piece of cloth or bedding in his hands, maybe something to try to hide a knife, but this was consistent across all of the witnesses. Most of them also described the same type of clothing, and they all said that he was a very tall man with red bushy hair and that he appeared drunk because he was unsteady on his feet. Does that sound a little bit familiar? A handful of witnesses also saw this man running into the woods. This was likely after the attack had occurred, and a handful of others actually saw the vehicle that this person may have been driving. They said that there was this orange or red car that had been backed into the woods near the Wicklund's home. That night, they decided to immediately call out a cadaver dog to try to see what way this person could have gone, maybe try to track them. And sure enough, this dog ended up corroborating exactly what all these witnesses had said, because the dog led officers to the back of the Wicklund property, exactly where people saw him running into the woods and exactly where this car was thought to have been parked. To try to figure out who this man may have been, to see if anyone knew what they were talking about. Already these descriptions are kind of matching what Dawn has said about this guy that had attacked Renee 8 years prior, but they wanted to make sure they covered all of their bases. So one of the first people that they spoke to was a man named Glenn, who was actually Renee's boyfriend at the time. So Glenn said he hadn't seen Renee since the previous Sunday. It was now a Wednesday going into Thursday. And he said that there had actually been a few odd things going on with Renee lately. So Glenn said that he had tried to call her that day at about 5:30 p.m. and she never called him back. We obviously have established at this point in time that she was likely deceased, because we do know that Barbara was killed almost immediately after coming to the home at 4:30. But he also said that Renee had been really paranoid and worried about some man named Casaro lately. So according to what Renee told him, this Casaro individual was a financial consultant. He was, I guess, following Renee, and Renee also had mentioned to Glenn that she had been receiving threatening phone calls to her house phone, but she said that she didn't recognize whoever was on the phone, and I guess Glenn was assuming that whoever was making these threatening calls was Casaro, and if Casaro had been following her or making these threatening calls, it's not a stretch of the imagination to believe that maybe he came to her home that day, killed her, her daughter, and Barbara. When they asked Glenn, well, what about this guy that sexually assaulted her 8 years before? And when Glenn heard this, he's like, wait a minute, what? That's not something that Renee has ever told me about. So again, Renee was traumatized by this event, and this was not something she wanted to share with everyone. So Glenn wasn't even aware of this. So this kind of led authorities to a dead end, at least with Glenn. They next decided to speak to anyone that knew Barbara. They decided to speak to her daughter. Now, this daughter said that there was no one she could think of that would have wanted to harm Barbara. Barbara was just like a really chill, down low kind of person, didn't bother anybody. But she said that her mom had told her a handful of very concerning things in regards to Renee recently. Barbara's daughter said that she had spoken to her mom, and Barbara said that Renee was having some issues in regards to her work. Now, she'd always worked in beauty salons, but when Jack and Renee separated, Renee obviously needed to make a little bit more money, so she was working at a handful of salons. She was an executive assistant at some of these salons. She was working at beauty schools around the area. She was helping young girls get financial aid, things like that. And so she was working a lot of hours so that she could afford her life and to take care of her daughter. And according to what Barbara told her daughter, Renee said that she was approached by I don't know who, someone that was trying to force her to hand a load of her work to someone else, which would cut her money, cut her hours, all of that. And Renee refused. She was like, you're not going to force me out of this. I love my job. I want this work. I want this money. And Renee claimed that after this, someone started following her. Some strange man was pretty much watching her every single movement. She believed that someone was out to get her because she wouldn't hand over this time, I guess, this work for the beauty salons. Right away, they decided to look into this Casaro individual while they were also trying to figure out details about the man that had attacked Renee 8 years prior. Now, when they managed to locate this Casaro individual, they were able to figure out that obviously that Casaro and then the man that Barbara's daughter was speaking about, being followed and this work issue, it was actually the same person. So she was talking about Casaro as well. But they were never able to prove conclusively that Casaro had ever followed Renee. They were able to actually entirely rule him out. He had an alibi. There was no way at all that he could have been involved in the murder of all three of these individuals. So they were back at square one. So at this point, the detectives are like, okay, we've got to get focused on this person that had attacked them because the motive could be there. But if what Don was saying was true, that this individual was found guilty, that both Barbara and Renee had testified against him, he's probably locked up somewhere, and the chances that he was out and able to do anything like this are slim to none. But also, what are the chances of someone going through two horrific attacks like this? It's just not very likely. So they started to look into all of the different documents and found out about Charles Campbell. They decided to look into his DMV records to see what kind of car he drove just out of curiosity, and they were shocked when they saw that he drove an orange Ford Torino, which was exactly the kind of car that every single one of the witnesses had spoken to them about. But when they looked deeper, they also saw that he had in fact been convicted of not just this assault against Renee, but also the burglary and the other assault, and that he was supposed to be serving 45 years in Walla Walla Penitentiary. And they at first thought this was a dead end. He's supposed to be serving. It's only been, 8 years, not even. How on earth? He couldn't have managed to pull this off. But as soon as they were ready to say there's no way, they realized that somehow he had been let out on work release. And the location he was at was only 10 miles away from the Wicklund home. On May 11th, 1976, he had started serving his time for those three separate convictions. And again, he was supposed to stay at Walla Walla, but somehow in less than a month, on June 7th, 1976, he ended up being transferred to Washington State Reformatory in Monroe. No one really knows why state officials decided to move him from Walla Walla, which is a pretty high security, to this reformatory in Monroe. And also, no authorities or Renee were notified that he was now being moved back to Snohomish counties. Apparently, when all this was happening, his mom was made aware that he was being moved to a lower security prison, and she ended up writing a letter to the state basically saying that that was a horrible idea and would end very badly. So Betty Lou told the state in this letter that her son had a lot of sexual issues, that he had, quote, strange ideas about women, that he needed to be in a high security situation, and he needed a ton of help, essentially, because there was something going on. She said that he had even sexually assaulted their dog when he was younger. She tried to warn them the best that she could, but somehow it ended up being ignored. Now, obviously, this letter was received because the state did approach Charles about this information. He denied ever sexually assaulting the dog or any of the other things that his mother said. He ended up openly admitting that he had killed his dog by strangulation. He said that that same dog his mom was saying that he sexually assaulted, he killed because it didn't listen to him. So somehow, despite having all of this information, they decided to still let him move to the reformatory in Monroe. Now, pretty much immediately after doing this, he begins getting in trouble left and right because when he is given an inch, he takes an absolute mile. So on September 29th, 1976, a little over a month after being transferred, he was found with a gallon of homemade liquor. He had stolen yeast to make this liquor from the reformatory kitchen. Then in 1977, the following year, he ended up in a lot of trouble for hitting one of the other inmates in the reformatory. It caused some pretty serious head injuries, so it was not just like a quick punch, like he severely harmed this individual. The following year in 1978, his roommate accused him of sexually assaulting him. And then shortly after this, just a few months later in 1979, he ends up going in for a psychological review by R.A. Mainman, and it is said that Campbell is a conflicted man who, quote, has declared war on society, all of whom he regards as mindless nitwits who are getting theirs and are now out to get him. The resident is is further seen as insensitive, uncaring of others, conscienceless, malevolently intolerable of the social order which imprisons him, and eminently harmful to all who directly or indirectly capture his attention or interest. So basically, he just seems to be playing this game of life, and anyone who comes across him, he can decide you're a victim for absolutely no reason. He does not care what he ends up doing to you. He goes on to sexually assault another one of his cellmates. I have even seen that one of his cellmates was a childhood best friend of his, and he sexually assaulted this man as well. And one of the men that he sexually assaulted, he ended up threatening to kill if they said anything about it, because last time it ended up getting him in trouble. Now, amazingly, after all of this horrific behavior where he is harming people, sexually assaulting them, stealing them, breaking rules, is said to be conscienceless and an eminently harmful to everyone. In 1981, he ends up going in front of the parole board, who decides to waive his sentence, his mandatory sentence, and basically makes him eligible for minimum custody status. I don't know, you guys. I literally do not know. So his minimum sentence had been, I think, for like 7 years. So that was what he would at least have to serve before being eligible for parole. And they basically decided to waive all of it and say, you know what? He can somehow, after all of this, be sent to minimum security. Do you know what their reasoning was? They said he could go to minimum security because he was a model prisoner. You guys, he was given this based off of good behavior. We got a problem here. By September 1981, just a few months later, he ended up being transferred to what is known as the Honor Farm, which is this minimum security area outside of like the walls and gates of the actual prison. And from my understanding, you're not like fully able to leave whenever you want. I couldn't get a good grasp on exactly how that works. I think you can be like furloughed or something like that, or people can pay for you to get out temporarily to do certain things, but it is a very basic security type of situation, something that he never should have been able to have. And then not even a month later, in October of 1981, somehow, some way, after only spending a month at this honor farm, he is released to an even more minimal security situation when he is transferred to the Monroe Work Release Program in Everett, right across from the county courthouse in Snohomish County, 10 miles away from where Renee lived. So at this point, being in a work release situation, he obviously had certain rules that he had to follow. There's like no drinking, no drugs, like I'm pretty sure there's curfews, things like that, but you are allowed to leave for work purposes. However, he did not see those rules as applying to him, which comes as absolutely no surprise. So he goes in there in October. By January, he ends up sexually assaulting his ex-wife while he's supposed to be at work. So he leaves this area. He's supposed to head to work. Instead, he goes to find his ex-wife that had left him, took their daughter because of how abusive he was, and he rapes her. And she ends up going and reporting this to police, yet somehow still nothing is done. So he is still allowed to be in this work release program. And a month later, he is transferred to another work release. And this is the one in Everett. The other one was the Monroe one. I don't know why I mixed those up. But at this one, he obviously does not behave any better. Ended up having 4 different infractions in the first 30 days of even being at this new work release program. So honestly, he should have immediately been moved back to at least the Honor Farm. Honestly, should have been in Walla Walla, but whatever. So the investigators are seeing all of this information, like that he had basically somehow managed to sneak his way all the way down to the bare minimum security when he never should have been given that chance. And they decided to reach out to someone at this Everett release program. And this individual, they asked, where was he on April 14th that night? Did he come back? And they were like, you know what? Actually, that night he was sent back to Monroe Reformatory because he broke our rules when it comes to drinking. We found a whole bunch of beers in his car. And so all I can think when I hear that is, okay, so you sent him back for drinking, but he was able to sexually assault someone that reported it to police, and that didn't have him sent back. Like, that could have been another place where something could have been done to ultimately save the lives of 3 individuals. Now, this person at the work release program said, come on down here. His car is still here. You can basically, ask questions, do whatever you want. So the investigators went to this Everett work release program and looked around his car. Sure enough, it's caked with mud. Tires are covered in mud. The underside of the car is covered in mud. And when they look, the driver's side door handle has what appears to be blood on it. And then the main thing they saw that made them think, all right, we think we may have our guy, is that on the seat of his car was a tiny pearl earring. And the earrings of all 3 women had been ripped out. Right away, they decide to go to the courthouse, and they get 3 separate warrants, one to actually physically search the inside of the vehicle, another one to search his room where he had been staying at the work release, since clearly he did come back that night and then was very swiftly taken away, and also to search Charles himself, as well as all of his clothing and things that he had been wearing when he was transferred back to Monroe Reformatory after he potentially committed these murders. Now, when they started searching his car, they were able to find multiple pieces of jewelry in the car. There was, in fact, blood on the driver's side area of the car. And when they searched the clothing that Campbell had been wearing that day, they found some more jewelry in his pockets. Clothing that he had been wearing matched the description of the clothing that all of the witnesses said the strange man hanging around the Wicklund's home had been wearing the day of the murders. They took a bunch of DNA samples from Charles and went on to figure out if he had any sort of alibi, because from what he was saying, he really didn't have one. And it seems that Charles really just wouldn't speak to anyone anyways. From my understanding, he never really said a single thing about the murders. They went to the job that he was supposed to be working at when he left that morning of the 14th and found that he had never actually made it into work that day. So Charles Campbell did not have an alibi. And things ended up getting even deeper. This was all over the news. It's a triple homicide in this quaint little town. Obviously, the media went absolutely crazy with it. And someone that had been with Charles that night, who was in the work release program, ended up coming forward to authorities. So this man said that he had been with Charles that night, which would have been after the murders. He said that Charles came back to the work release program house, and he said that Charles was acting super jittery and excited, which makes my stomach turn. And he said that Charles was like, hey, do you want to go out and have a few drinks with me at the lake or at Snohomish River? And obviously this guy's like, yeah, sure, why not? And he remembered that Charles was like, okay, cool, I just want to shower first. And he remembered that was the first red flag, aside from the way that Charles was acting and his energy, because Charles apparently never bathed. He never took care of himself. It was just not something he wanted to spend time on. So he brushed it off, said whatever. They hopped into Charles' car and went to Snohomish River. He said when they got there, they had a few beers, which is likely what ended up having him sent back to Monroe Reformatory. But he said that in the middle of drinking, Charles said, you know what, hold on a minute, I have to do something real quick. And he went back up, got his car, drove his car down to the edge of the river, and then sneakily started doing something. And this guy said that it seemed like he was trying to do something that he didn't want anyone else to see. And he remembered when they had walked to the car originally that Charles had something wrapped up inside of a blanket that he had brought with him and put into the back of his car. So right away, police are like, okay, we've got to gather more evidence in this case. We've got to make sure that we get this guy good. So they take divers out to the Snohomish River, and sure enough, they find a ton of things. They ended up finding a bracelet. They found 3 earrings, 2 necklaces, a brass object of some kind, which honestly, when I heard that, it stopped my heart for a second, because when Renee had moved from her home, her farm with her family, she had brought a whole bunch of old brass farm implements and things to remind her of her favorite place on earth with her to decorate her new home with. So I really hope it was not one of those that had been taken. And they also found some random piece of pottery, and all of these things ended up being from the Wicklund home. So on April 19th, Charles was arrested for the murders of Renee, Shanna, and Barbara, and he was booked into Snohomish County Jail. This case continued to buzz around in the media because there was this huge question as to how on earth this man even was able to get out of prison to begin with. That made absolutely no sense. A retired county sheriff, Bob Dodge, said, quote, "He didn't just kill them, he mutilated them. He raped and sodomized both women and the little girl. Why was this man on work release? They don't have the answers." He also went on to say that if Renee had known that Campbell had been released, that she would have been scared to death and likely would have done something to try to protect herself, which she never should have had to do to begin with. But everyone was trying to figure out how he got released, how this was possible, and it seemed like no one could answer. Washington State could not tell anyone how this managed to happen, and I'll get more into the details of that in a little bit. October of 1982, the jury selection process began. Now, it did originally start in Snohomish County where all of this had occurred, but they very, very quickly realized that way too many people knew what was going on and they had seen everything on the news, had already kind of formed opinions. So having an unbiased trial did not seem very likely. The media had just too much coverage that was out. I think they had even started a petition in Clearview, have them push for the death penalty. So they decided they needed to completely move it 300 plus miles away to Spokane, Washington. Now, when this happened, Campbell said he was not going all the way to Spokane to be a part of the jury selection. He wanted to stay where he was in Snohomish. And this ended up becoming a point of tension. Right away, the prosecution shot this down. They said, heck no, we are not allowing you to not come to this because it is a right for, the defense, for whoever is being charged with something to be a part of this process of jury selection because they need to make sure they're given the most fair trial possible. And by him trying to waive that right, the prosecution was worried that he would try to come back later on and then use that as the base for an appeal, which, spoiler alert, is exactly what he did. So to make sure that they covered all bases, they decided to sit down in a courtroom and under complete recording, they basically spoke to a judge. Campbell said, "I don't want to go. I completely trust my attorneys to make the best decisions for me. I don't want to go that far away." So everything was recorded and the judge agreed that he would not have to go to the jury selection in Spokane. Right away, the trial started and it was very clear from the get-go that the defense kind of did a crappy job. The defense essentially had absolutely no argument at all, other than saying that the police department did not pursue any other possible suspects. They did not explore anybody else, that they essentially looked at Campbell and said, hey, he's got this serious criminal history. He had an encounter with her before. Clearly he is involved, which was a really crap and weak argument to begin with because they had already ruled out another individual. They had spoke to this Casaro guy. They had followed him from start to finish. And then after he was ruled out, the rest of the evidence led them directly to Campbell. So I don't even know why they bothered with that argument. They did, however, manage to knock down one of the charges, which was quite a shock to me and is going to infuriate you more than likely. Somehow, his defense attorneys said that the rape allegations and charges needed to be dropped because Renee had been sexually assaulted with an inanimate object, but they said that this was done post-mortem, and that is confirmed by the autopsy that was done by Coroner Haberman. And they said because she was dead, it was not technically sexual assault. They even had Coroner Haberman get up on stand, and he was like, look, even if you slit her throat and then she was sexually assaulted, there is a chance that the brain is still active for a handful of minutes afterwards. And she may have been very well aware of what you were doing to her. But still, I don't even know why the judge decided to side with the defense, drop the sexual assault charges, which blows my mind. Other than that, the defense really didn't have anyone. They didn't have any witnesses. They didn't have any evidence or anything like that. But the prosecution basically had a crap ton of witnesses and evidence. So multiple witnesses took the stand. Campbell's own girlfriend at the time took the stand. Her name was Judith Dirks, and she actually met him in the Monroe Reformatory. She was his, I think, drug and alcohol counselor, and they started a relationship, and she ended up being fired because of this relationship. That's obviously not something that is allowed at all, but they continued their relationship from there. And actually, just prior to the trial starting and the jury selection and all of that, Judith gave birth to a son that belonged to Charles Campbell. I don't know how she managed to put aside all of the things that he had done and had been charged of and why he was in prison to begin with, and all the things that he did while he was in prison. But the information she had was even more unsettling. So she claimed that the whole time that she had been dating Charles Campbell, he made it very clear how much he hated Renee and Barbara. It had been 8+ years, but he was not budging on his resentment towards them and blaming them for the fact that he was in prison, which makes absolutely no sense. And he even told Judith that he was going to get back at them, that he wanted them to feel how he felt in prison. And so according to Judith, somehow after being released, or not released, but put in this work release program, he managed to get his hands on the original court documents, all of the transcripts from the original trial. And by doing so, he was able to find her address. When he found her address, he immediately began to follow Renee. He would tell Judith about this. She remembered one time in specific, he said that he hid in the trees by her home and watched her carry her groceries in. And he did this for an extended period of time. So maybe this Casaro person isn't who was following her, this man that she was noticing, but it was actually Charles. And that makes all of my hair stand up. She had also seen Charles the day of the murder. She said that he showed up to her home early that morning of the 14th, and he was clearly drunk and had also brought a 6-pack with him that he continued to drink. He was going on and on about something that day. I can't remember exactly what it was, and she eventually ended up leaving him at her home when she went off to work, and said that when she came back later on, she noticed that one of her large butcher knives in her kitchen was gone. Now, unfortunately, it's great that she did come forward and testify against him in court. That's something that she should have done, but I just do not understand, as someone who was working in the prison system, how she did not come forward when he was specifically speaking about getting back at the women, that had put him in prison, as he's on this work release, and he's stalking her, he's stalking his victim, and she's still just not going to say anything. That was just another opportunity where all 3 of these lives could be saved. Now, despite the fact that he would not take the stand himself, upon seeing his girlfriend and now the mother of another one of his children stand up and testify against him, Campbell all of a sudden wants to talk, and he himself ends up cross-examining her. There must have been some sort of abuse going on in this relationship as well, because it seems like he just psychologically scared the crap out of her, and he somehow ended up getting her to take back pretty much everything that she said, that he hadn't been, saying bad things about these women, and that he wanted to get back of them, and that he wasn't stalking them, all of these things. So ultimately, what she said in the end didn't necessarily matter, because he got her to take it all back. But his girlfriend was not the only person that he had seen that day. He apparently, after that, went on to see one of their mutual female friends who he attempted to sexually assault. She also, from my understanding, took the stand and testified against him and his mindset that day. They brought the 11-year-old girl who had seen him creeping around the home. She testified. She actually was able to pick him out of a lineup prior to this, so thank goodness for that. Pretty much anyone they could get to take the stand, any of the witnesses that saw anything that day, they all came up and said something. And they also brought forward the man that had been with him that night when they went to the Snohomish River to drink. Now, he completely reiterated the story that he had told to police, and this was one of the only other times that the defense decided to say something and fight back. From my understanding, they essentially never cross-examined pretty much anyone other than this girlfriend and maybe this other guy from the work release program. They never really had any objections. They just sat there like a bump on a log and let it all happen. And I think it's because they knew those two individuals were probably their best bet at taking down the prosecution's argument. So they tried to say that this individual from the work release program was actually just as capable of being responsible for these murders. They were like, he's probably just trying to pin this on him. It's really easy for other inmates to want to have an easy out by putting the blame on someone else. And they tried really hard to fight this at the trial, but the prosecution was like, nice try, but do you think we would really come this far and bring this witness forward without having an alibi that would prove he was not possibly responsible? This guy had an alibi for the time of the murders. There was no way that he was there, so that was a big old hit, miss, and sink. The final piece of evidence, which was really the only large piece of evidence that wasn't just circumstantial in terms that the prosecution brought forward, was the bloody handprint on that glass. So they'd actually sent an FBI fingerprint analyst to look into this, and they testified at the trial saying that the drinking glass in the home had Campbell's handprint on it, and there was like no way at all of getting around it. So typically the minimum amount of points of comparison that have to match when you are trying to match fingerprints, palm prints, anything like that is 8. And that's usually like, okay, this is probably a match unless something better pops up. There were 15 points of comparison that were a match on this handprint on the glass, matching Charles Campbell. So at that point, there is essentially no other way that that handprint could have matched anyone else, which places his hand being covered in blood at the crime scene during the triple homicide. So at this point, on November 26, 1982, after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Charles Campbell guilty of capital murder. Everyone had been pushing for the death penalty. When Charles was in trial, he showed absolutely no signs of remorse. Like, they put full-on photographs from the autopsy up and directly in front of his face, and he didn't wince. Nothing, absolutely nothing. He barely spoke, showed no emotion at all. Everyone wanted this guy completely gone. By November 17th, 1982, everyone got what they want, and Charles Campbell was sentenced to death. So at this time, I don't think there had been a hanging death in 30 years. But when someone gets the death penalty in the state of Washington, they have to choose whether they want their death to be by lethal injection or hanging. And Charles refused to choose an option. So by default, when that happens, it's automatically hanging. He was sent back to Walla Walla State Penitentiary to await his execution date. Now, prosecutor Eric Lind said that Campbell's own mother had basically given up on helping him, and this was her response when she found out that he had received the death penalty. Eric Lind said, quote, "She basically said death might be the best thing for him. It wasn't that she hated him. It was that she tried everything. It was a recognition of his evilness. I view Campbell as this kind of intensely evil person who feels that anybody he doesn't like is worthy of destruction. I have no doubt that if he was given a free pass out of prison, he has a short list of people he would kill, and I'm on that list." And that kind of goes back to what the psychologist found when they were doing the exam on him while he was originally in Monroe Reformatory, is that he's conscienceless, and anyone who comes across him, whether by accident or on purpose, he ultimately sees them as the next victim. He does not care about anybody. The psychiatrist that did his evaluation to make sure he was competent for trial also said that he had a very unorthodox view of reality, saying, quote, "To use his words, the world has created me, and I am free to do what I want. There is no right or wrong or anyone to tell me what to do." But as expected, right away, he put in a slew of appeals, because keep in mind, up until this point, Charles Campbell had never really actually had to suffer the consequences of what he had done. He had sat in the reformatory for almost 8 years, but I mean, he was supposed to be there for 45 and he got out. All these other times, he was just, been like, okay, well, actually, no, never mind. You're not that bad. We'll release you on good behavior, or we're not even going to get you in trouble at all. So I think in his mind, he genuinely believed that these appeals were going to go through. So I'm just going to read off of a timeline real quick, all of the different appeals that he was a part of. So November 6, 1984, Washington State Supreme Court affirms Campbell's conviction and sentence. So they basically shot him down right away. Within 2 years of being sentenced to death, he was not going to get out of it. April 29th, 1985, a year later, the U.S. Supreme Court completely denies Campbell's request for another hearing because they've already shot him down once. On February 1986, the U.S. District Court denies Campbell's first federal appeal. On October 6, 1987, another year later, the Ninth Circuit affirms the district court's decision. November 7th, 1988, the U.S. Supreme Court again refuses to hear Campbell's case. He is going in as hard as he possibly can, but it is not working. And on February 15th, 1989, Snohomish County Superior Court sets his execution date for March 30th, 1989. Now, having that actual date scared the piss out of this man. So again, he files another appeal with the Supreme Court on March 7th, 1989. So literally weeks before he is supposed to be executed. And right away, like within a week of the execution, the Supreme Court rejects the challenges because they're just not having it. March 27th, so again, we're just creeping up to this execution date. U.S. District Judge rejects Campbell's second federal appeal. And then on March 28th, the following day, the Ninth Circuit ends up staying Campbell's execution pending an appeal. So from my understanding at this point, he had realized he had exhausted all options. There were multiple habeas corpus involved. I mean, he was doing the absolute most to try to get out of this. And the only thing they really had to hang on to at this point was to say his Eighth Amendment was being violated. That death by hanging, which was what was going to happen because he did not choose lethal injection, was cruel and unusual punishment. And obviously when that is being brought up, they have to put a stay on things. It halts everything. This was so strategically planned, it's ridiculous. So 3 days later, he did not end up being executed. September 13th, 1991, 2 years after the stay was put in place and is still in place, he files his third federal appeal. On January 13th, 1992, within a couple of months of filing this third appeal, the U.S. Supreme Court basically says there's unnecessary delays, there's unwarranted stays, they're starting to get frustrated with the state level of all of this, and ultimately by March 9th, 1992, they dismiss his third appeal entirely. We are now years into this stay, years after he is supposed to be executed, and there is still this argument on whether this is a violation of his Eighth Amendment. He is still continuously trying to get the Supreme Court to hear him. So the Supreme Court ended up ordering an evidentiary hearing on whether execution by hanging violates the Eighth Amendment. They set a time frame that this has to be figured out. Now there is an entire 40 plus page paper on what was found during this evidentiary hearing. I mean, they had doctors there speaking in depth about what happens when someone is hanged. It's very difficult to read through. Ultimately, on June 1st, 1993, it is ruled that death by hanging during an execution is not cruel and unusual punishment because the death is instantaneous. So he essentially managed to buy himself over 10 years of time by playing this game of appeals, which is exactly what he wanted. And I genuinely think he was shocked that he could not manage to get any of it to work, and now he was stuck and the execution was happening. And even during all of this, he had tried to convince the Supreme Court that he was actually a victim. His execution ended up being set for May 27th, 1994. It apparently was very difficult to even find someone who was an executioner that would perform a hanging. As I stated, I don't think it had been done in 30 years, and the hanging of Charles Campbell was the last hanging to ever happen in the state of Washington. They ended up having to pay someone a lot of money and protect their identity. Their identity is still not known to this day, to get someone to agree to come and do it. Also, The victims' families had to apparently fight incredibly hard to even have a seating at his execution. And it's honestly surprising that he made it there. So Campbell, the day of his execution, he was supposed to be executed May 27th at 12:01 a.m., so right after midnight. And when they went in to move him from his cell, where he was in maximum security, to the holding cell for his execution, he got down in the fetal position and would not move. They could not get him to stand up. They pepper sprayed him, did all this stuff. He wouldn't move. They could not get him to eat his final meal or choose his final meal. And eventually they did have to strap him onto a backboard and put a bag over his head to transfer him to his execution. Once he was there, he would not say any final words, and he did end up immediately dying from hanging. The nightmare was over. Now, this was in 94. By 96, they made it so that the default was not hanging any longer when it comes to choosing hanging or lethal injection when you are sentenced to death. I don't know if they did believe that hanging is actually cruel and unusual punishment, or if they just didn't want to have something like that happen again. There was also a civil suit against Washington State that was filed by Don, which again is Barbara's husband, and also Renee's mother, Hilda, for failing to notify Renee, because that, again, could have changed everything. And thankfully, the settlement won them over $2 million, and while that is great, it is never going to bring their loved ones back. And this never should have happened to begin with. There is a memorial for Shanna at the elementary school that she attended, and Don went on to work to try to help other victims of crimes. He started working with families and friends of missing persons and violent crimes. It was a way for him to try to help other people and kind of keep himself on track and do what Barbara would have wanted. But from what I've seen, the death of his wife and having to see the absolute massacre in the Wicklund home had just traumatized him so badly. He ended up being a heavy drinker and using drugs, and ultimately died due to one of those things. Renee's mom said, quote, "I have endured the suffering of sitting day after day, week after week in courts where the chief concern has been to see that a murderer's rights have been protected. Sadly, I feel the criminal justice system is just what it says, a system only of justice for the criminal." Tried to find more information on the lawsuit that Don and Hilda filed against Washington State, but unfortunately I was not able to find any. Finally, after everything was kind of settled and things quieted down a bit, obviously, there was still the question of how on earth was this man allowed to be put in a work release program. So there was a probe done into the parole board. Again, I've tried to find information on this, and it is few and far between, but they apparently found that thousands of inmates between the years of 1977 and 1980 may have been paroled without the board even having any of their behavioral history at all. Which is very clear because Charles Campbell had been released because of good behavior, which was far from the case. He had sexually assaulted multiple people, had created liquor while there. I think he'd even attacked multiple guards. So clearly there was no good behavior. And when this probe was done, the parole board did say that it was just some weird misunderstanding, that there probably was a mess up with their files and things got crisscrossed. I also tried to find more information on that to see, did they decide to go through all of those thousands of inmates' records at that point to see if someone had been wrongfully released. I tried to find something to, I guess, make myself and you guys feel better about the fact that thousands of potentially violent individuals were released. But again, I just could not seem to find anything. Now, the one good thing that really came out of this is that this pushed Washington State to ultimately pass laws that made it mandatory to notify victims and victims' families and friends when perpetrators, violent ones at that, are released from prison. Again, something that kind of should have been common sense to begin with. The fact that Snohomish County Sheriff's Department was not notified when he went from Walla Walla to the Monroe Reformatory is wild. The fact that they never notified Renee, the fact that nobody knew all these different things were happening, there was no one to keep anyone in check, which is ironic in a world of checks and balances. It's just crazy to me. All the deaths of Renee and Shanna and Barbara never should have happened to begin with. I'm happy that at least something was put in place because of their deaths to potentially protect other victims down the line. Washington ended up becoming a part of the VINE program, which stands for Victim Information and Notification Every Day. From the website, it says VINE's primary focus is to provide information and notification regarding offender custody status updates to victims of crime. It's no cost at all. You can go on and register yourself. I'm pretty sure anyone can do it, and you will be notified when someone in specific is released from prison so that you are able to protect yourself. You get constant custody status updates, things like that. Also, when I was doing my research, I found a pretty awesome service. It's called VSS, Victim Support Services. Now, there's things like this in every single state. This one is specific to certain areas in Washington. It's a really awesome nonprofit organization. It's actually the oldest one to exist in Washington state to help victims of crime through, according to their website, advocacy, education, and awareness. There's a lot of different ways that you can donate to help them. They have a lot of different items that you can send in that they can then use to help these different victims of violence. And it was started by the mother of a young girl that was abducted and killed in Washington in 1975. So this is something that has started with a purpose and continues with a purpose. And it's a great nonprofit organization to support and use if you are in the state of Washington. Hopefully you guys have learned something from this, and this encourages you to look into the area that you're in, see if there's any victim support services near you that you can volunteer with or donate to try to help someone in your own community. Again, if you have any suggestions of certain crimes that have directly impacted victims' advocacy or have changed laws in the areas that you are in, please make sure to leave those suggestions down below so I can try to look into them and create a video. And on that note, that is all that I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Barbara's, Renee's, and Shanna's story. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallen fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.